Now to introduce our three presenters today, starting with Keith McCammon, the Chief Security Officer with Red Canary. Keith leads Red Canary's security organization and is responsible for the company's security strategy, operations, and innovative threat detection approach. He has nearly 2 decades of technology experience, much of it focused on identifying and solving complex problems related to information security and risk. He also has hands-on experience in offensive security operations. You'll also hear from Casey Smith, Director of Applied Research. Prior to joining Red Canary, he was a principal analyst for a large financial institution, where he served as Red Team leader, oversaw incident response efforts, and deployed application whitelisting and endpoint monitoring across the organization. Casey has spoken at several security conferences, including ShmooCon, DerbyCon, Troopers, and Blue Hat. He has a passion for understanding and testing the limits of defensive systems. Finally, you'll hear from Frank McLean, Senior Threat Analyst with Red Canary. Frank is an accomplished cyber investigator and information assurance practitioner with deep experience in digital forensics and incident response. He managed security operations for a national financial services firm for several years, where he built and led the team responsible for continuous monitoring, threat analysis, and incident response. With that, let me turn this over to our presenters from Red Canary. Gentlemen, it's all yours.
Hi, thank you very much. This is Keith McCammon from Red Canary. Want to take a moment and thank ISMG for hosting us. Thanks to fellow panelists here and to everyone on the line for taking the time to join us. Hopefully this is informative. Going to walk through very briefly, just kind of rehash the overview. Again, the objective here is to help understand how lean security teams, which includes companies that don't have a dedicated security function and are interested in building one, can in fact stay abreast of current threats and implement operation solutions to help address them, regardless of organization size and budget. We're going to do that again by walking through some examples of evolving threats and trends. We're going to talk a little bit about how to assess those risks and identify gaps within your organization in a number of different areas, not all technology focused. We'll talk through a couple of examples. These are things that we see in the wild and have seen for some time. We'll kind of talk through those, in the context of what that means, to your organization in terms of technology investment, but also investment in people and process and just overall program maturity. And then we'll talk through some recommendations and strategies that we've seen the folks successfully employ. So let's start by giving a really high-level overview of some year-over-year trends. These trends that you see here are things that stand out, that have stood out as we've progressed through the years. An important thing to understand as we talk through this is that threats that we've seen in the past aren't going away, right? So while each of these years we kind of have a prevailing theme that we see, but keep in mind that as you move from 2014 into 2015, 2014's problems don't go away. They morph a little bit and they continue to evolve too. So you really have this kind of additive effect. And so looking back, rewinding a few years, banking Trojans and credential and financial theft really were kind of at the pinnacle of what we saw, not in terms of sophistication, but in terms of volume. And so theft of man-in-the-browser attacks, things like that, things targeting financial institutions, customers directly, and really from a financial institution perspective, imposing a lot of cost in terms of fraud and abuse, detection and response to those things. That was a real prevailing theory, and that was actually 2014 is probably when we saw one of the biggest commoditizations of not only malware but software as a service platforms effectively to deliver that malware to a significant number of users at a really low cost. And as we talk through the rest of these, years and these trends, keep in mind that same commoditization and optimization on the attacker side has really continued. So in 2015, we see the introduction of crypto ransomware. That's when it really took off. Again, building upon that that really successful delivery platform that was refined in the years leading up to it. So everything that attackers learned about targeting users, targeting organizations, social engineering, they effectively just morphed the payload. And what they, the goal there was to go from making, a few cents or a few dollars per victim to making tens or hundreds or even thousands of dollars per victim, but really not drastically increasing their cost to execute those attacks. 2016, 2017, again, like previous years' theory, the prior years' trends have continued, right? And those attacks didn't really subside. These 2 years were really focused a lot more on evolution of very specific techniques, right? And this was in a direct response to improvements in controls. So 2016, you started to see the advent of fileless malware. Some really well-designed and well-implemented post-exploitation frameworks became available. 2017, building upon those, the payloads that are getting incorporated into all of these are focusing on victims with an increasing level of preventative sophistication. So financial services in particular has kind of always been at the forefront of preventative controls and security, security programs in general. And so things like application whitelisting and very positive approaches to security. Now you're starting to see attackers go directly after and either attack those systems themselves, but more likely dig farther into the platforms that are being protected. And so learning more about Windows and the Mac OS operating systems and even Linux, and really starting to hunt for vulnerabilities and vulnerable configurations inside of those platforms to execute some bypasses. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Casey, who will kind of talk a little bit more about kind of the technical aspects of this latest evolution of attack.
Certainly. So the title of this slide is Living Off the Land, which is a term I first heard in 2013 at a presentation at DerbyCon, where the presenters described the idea of using built-in tools and capabilities to accomplish their objectives. So rather than bringing a new binary or a new set of code, there were certainly plenty of tools available on systems that allowed you to accomplish your objective. So the idea of living off the land, in a sense, is leveraging those built-in tools and trying to blend in with normal behavior of like a sysadmin or even a user, so that you are less likely to be caught by some of the controls that may be in place. A couple of examples of this that we've seen an uptick in the last couple of years, like Keith was talking about, would be PowerShell and Windows Management Instrumentation, which is WMI. So these are two capabilities that ship with the operating system, and they're used effectively by system administrators to control the fleet. In this situation, these would be Windows-based capabilities. But attackers can certainly try and use those same tools and scripting language to accomplish their objectives. So there's a fair amount of effort to get visibility and logging of what's actually happening with PowerShell or WMI. It's definitely increased in the last year or so with the latest version of PowerShell, including quite a bit of logging and auditing of what commands are being executed. WMI, again, still one of those gaps where it's hard to determine what's actually an attacker and what's normal operations in your environment. So these are examples of places that attackers have moved into in an increasing sophistication to try and live off the land and to use these built-in capabilities to affect their objective on your organization.
Yeah, and if I could, Casey, one of the things you mentioned that these are things that are included in the core Windows platform, right? So they're services or applications that are installed by default, which is from a defender's perspective is something that we've struggled with for a long time. Although usually the simple solution is to turn those things off, right? And it's interesting when you mention that when you highlight these two in particular, not only are they things that are there by default, but they're things that in all likelihood you probably can't turn off because other parts of your organization likely depend on them, right? So PowerShell and WMI are really good examples of things that your systems administration team likely uses, other applications use, as in installation or management harnesses, and are really core to operations of the network in general. So it's they're things that you can't just decide to disable, even though they're there by default.
Exactly. Yep.
So the net effect of this, and the same thing has been true if you kind of look at almost any slice of a few years from a securities perspective, looking historically, is that the security program that worked a few years ago doesn't necessarily work today. The realities in terms of hiring, attacker capabilities, accessibility of software, the cost of software and services are just kind of fundamentally changing the way that controls and programs are implemented over time. And so we'll dig into this a little bit, and we'll talk through how to start by just assessing risks and understanding gaps inside of your organization. And at a really high level, we'll talk through evaluating your controls, understanding your capabilities, and we'll actually dig in a little bit in what makes a capability, right? There's people have different opinions. If you buy a piece of software, do you now have a capability? If you hire someone, do you now have a capability? And we'll dig into that a little bit. And then we'll talk to the third stage, which is what we refer to as just really simply deployment, right? So not only operationalizing these first two things, your controls and capabilities, but most importantly, like making sure that you can sustain a cycle of learning, right, in a number of different ways.
So I think in this one, this is something that I'm really interested in, is the evaluation of your controls. How do you know that the controls are going to detect the actual attacks? How do you actually assess gaps in that? So one of the things that we want to talk about is what we are referring to as the MITRE framework, or the attack framework. Some of you may have heard of this before, but it's just an abbreviation for adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge. And you can see in this slide, when an attacker tries to accomplish their objectives, there's a series of phases that they move through, moving left to right on the arrows. You can see there's different components. There's a recon phase, weaponization, delivery, exploit. This framework really focuses on the attacker is now in your environment. So focusing on those last three phases of control, execute, and maintaining presence in there. And then those are broken down into discrete steps or phases. And what we really like about this approach is it's a catalog of these tactics that are defined by operating system, and it gives you incredible references and details about the attack. And so one of the things that we think is really interesting is to take this matrix and align this matrix with the controls that you have in place, and take a look at one of these attacks in the MITRE framework, which we'll talk about in a moment, and see where would the detection or prevention components lie within your organization, and then prioritize these to go after these attacks to see what are attackers using today, what's happening to other organizations that we're seeing in this framework, because it may not have happened to you, but there's likely references to other organizations that have seen these attacks. So this framework gives you really good details on how to prepare for what you may be facing in the future within your organization. So we really like this. This is an open source framework. This is not something that Red Canary controls. This is something that MITRE has developed, but we really wanted to share this with you and make sure you were aware of it and able to explore and exploit this framework for your evaluation of your controls.
Yeah, and actually, if I can, if I can add one thing, normally if we had a room here, this would be a great time to just ask for a show of hands and understand, who's familiar with this particular framework and who's not. One of the things that's always really helpful is to understand where this framework sits with respect to all of the other frameworks and the ways that we think about security programs and controls and how the two interact. So, if you think about the attack matrix is really kind of like, it's a very operational matrix, right? Again, as Casey just described, like this is a great way. This is a way to measure your controls in a very realistic way, mapping to things that people are seeing in the wild and have seen over time. You kind of link above that. You could, if you think about this in terms of, for instance, like the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, right? The attack matrix is somewhere in the middle of that. And even if you go a step above that, if you're familiar with things like the cyber defense matrix, where you're thinking, much more abstractly about a security program, again, we're dealing almost exclusively in kind of the prevent and detect space inside of a matrix like that. So just want to kind of set that and frame what we're going to talk about here relative to the many other things that we know you're considering as you build and measure your security program and establish priorities. So the next thing we'll introduce here is what we're referring to as minimum viable collection. And this is important just because a lot of what we're going to talk about is going to be very endpoint focused, not exclusively, but wanted to set the stage for what we assume everyone has, and kind of the two big pillars of security instrumentation that exist, and that's that you've got some amount of network visibility and that you've got some amount of endpoint visibility. The assertion is that without those two things, you've definitely got a glaring gap, and you've got an issue with respect to visibility that's going to meaningfully impact your ability to do things like fill in your attack matrix, right? Some of those things are detectable via network controls. Most are detectable via endpoint controls. But having the combination of the two, again, is kind of, that's the position that I think every organization wants to be in as they start to think through, really advanced detection and response.
And if I can add in there, Keith, too, just, used to be that your perimeter was very well defined and you knew everything that existed within that bucket. But in recent years, with, everything moving to the cloud, from a hosting perspective, resource loading perspective, makes it a lot easier to offload those. And the end result of that then is the perimeter has become extremely flexible if it exists at all. And so realistically today, that perimeter is almost exclusively your endpoints, whether those are servers or workstations, laptops for staff that may be mobile. And so that really changes a lot of how you collect and look at data and what becomes useful to you from the standpoint of identifying those advanced threats, especially where they're doing, like Casey was talking about, the living off the land.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Frank. And actually, if we could dig in just I'd like to get a specific perspective from each of you on a couple of things here. So Frank, you've got a tremendous amount of experience doing really deep forensics, system by system, right? So a very low level understanding of operating systems, but have also a lot of experience applying that from an incident response standpoint, particularly in a financial services organization. What of these two things, right? Network collection and visibility has been really well established, which is not to say that new and interesting things aren't being done with it. But of the two, pervasive endpoint visibility is definitely the newer of the two, and the one that that if you walk into an organization may or may not be there. Can you just talk through in just a moment, a minute or two? Could you just explain, what endpoint visibility has kind of done, and how that's empowered folks, specifically dealing in incident response and investigation?
Absolutely. So really, if you look at things from the perspective of, you get some network-based alert, whether that's from firewall, IPS, potentially even a DLP product, right? That there's some activity occurring from a network perspective, possibly involving transmission of data to places that it shouldn't exist. Great, there's a problem. That's pretty easy to determine from that, at least a very high potential of problem. But then where do you go from there? Whether you are looking at things from an EDR perspective, or the perspective of a few years ago before EDR was really a thing, you still had to go to the endpoint, because you may know from the network side that there's an issue, but you don't know specifically what that issue is. You may not know how many hosts are involved with it, simply because as attackers pivot and move, the external connectivity indicators may be different from one system to the next. So purely from a network perspective, that can be difficult to correlate, to understand exactly what data has been exfiltrated, if indeed it has, and kind of, the whole scope of when did this start, going back to the beginning of it. And you can really only get that data from an endpoint. So in prior years, what I've had to do is that manual process of going to, identifying potentially impacted endpoints from network data, and then moving to those endpoints, collecting the boxes physically, trying to get, memory images, physical disk images, and start analyzing those. And that's difficult to do at scale. It certainly takes a lot of time, personnel, a lot of resources invested into it. And all that adds up to more money being spent in the long run. But you don't have a choice, right? If you're going to understand the scope of the compromise, you've got to end up on the endpoint. So having that visibility from the get-go, where you don't have to go back and manually try to recreate things where data may have been lost, because let's face it, if the breach was a year ago, and it's taken time for whatever reason to identify that it occurred, volatile data from those endpoints is probably gone. So you're left with the more static data. And while that's relevant and helpful, that may not give you exactly what you need. So going back in time becomes extremely difficult and more time consuming.
It's costly, right? Yeah, and effectively, I think you kind of just described just the kind of the shift and the decreasing cost of root cause analysis, right? Which is obviously what most forensic investigations are geared on. That's great. Thanks a lot, Frank. I appreciate that. And Casey, we've been, so free plug, right? Casey and I have been spending a lot of time working on a talk for DerbyCon coming up this weekend, and one of the things that we've been talking through a lot is how this shift in this kind of this minimum viable collection, or this basic footprint of low-level network and endpoint visibility, has actually changed things a lot for attackers too. So Casey, I don't know if you want to just give kind of like a 30-second or a minute just overview of what this basic footprint of collection, how that looks to the blue team, what problems that imposes for the red team, and kind of how things changed the dynamic in the last few years.
Sure. So, as a red team, one of our goals is to sort of challenge an organization to test their controls. And this level of collection has definitely raised the cost for attackers, and it's actually caught a lot of attackers because their tradecraft or the way they operate, where maybe they are using a particular capability, is now visible to an organization, and it wasn't before. For example, like Frank was talking about, the ability to trace a network connection all the way back to a process on a host gives you tremendous capabilities as an organization to quickly respond to these threats. So it's really been a game changer from how attackers think about getting into an organization. From a blue team perspective or defender, you now have a tremendous amount of data to sift through. And that's something that there's different techniques or approaches for that. But those are sort of the two ways to sort of think about how this technology, especially endpoint telemetry, has really been a game changer for the ways attacks occur and the ways that attack detection is accelerated.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yep. So we'll shift now into the next section, and what we'd like to do, wrapping up the first one, right? We want to understand controls, and I think what we've tried to lay out is just a really very high level footprint, right? Neither of these things are prescriptive in terms of the products or technologies that you choose, but prioritizing having a really solid network and endpoint collection is definitely, as we feel, kind of like just a fundamental building block to being able to build a solid security operations program. So what we'll talk through now is understanding your capabilities. And getting right into this, what you see over there on the right is kind of this, the people, process, and technology, which is kind of this, the triad that underpins almost all security, even information systems and technology. Any solution that gets fielded, whether it's a a line of business system or whether it's a security program. You can't just pick and choose from those things. You've got to have the right mix of all of them, and you've got to have a cycle of continuous improvement, right? So one of the things we like to talk through is the difference between tools and capabilities, and just kind of understand and set some expectations in terms of what we mean when we say those words, right? So tools map very closely to technology. There is there's a proclivity and kind of a common pitfall, which is to say, all right, I have a gap. What thing can I go buy to address that gap, right? What tool, what can I install on all of my endpoints, or what magic box can I put on my network so that I can check this off of my matrix and be done with this problem? And that's absolutely one of the things that you're going to need to do in almost every case. I think the important distinction between tools and capabilities is that again, think of tools as a building block, right? An underpinning of everything that you're going to do. You don't really have an operational capability until you add some people and some process to that, right? And it doesn't always have to be your people. And a lot of what we'll talk through in terms of strategy, and this also isn't specific to security at all. This is just a trend in technology and service delivery in general. Is that one of the hardest things to do as a CISO, particularly if you're building a new program, is to figure out how am I going to mix, what's the right mix of technology investment, investment in people, investment in management and governance, and kind of all of that, all the process that goes around operationalizing the data, the alerts, the response as an organization. And so again, when we talk about capabilities, think about that as having a technical underpinning or a technical tool in place, a collection, having people there who are equipped to understand the data that's coming out of those tools. In the case of things like network and endpoint collection, you've got a tremendous amount of data, and so one of the most expensive and time-consuming things is just to spend the time asking questions of that data, right? At a really high level. And then thinking through, you're looking down there at the other pitfalls. That second one becomes important, is that it's possible to make all of the right theoretical investments in technology to solve what you think are the problems, but what you've actually done is that you've overwhelmed your people, right? And you've overwhelmed your ability to put process in place and to operationalize those things well. So again, it's as is in the case with all service delivery disciplines, there's definitely a balance there that you need to strike. Next thing we'd like to talk through is just kind of mapping of services and resources, right? So we'll talk here specifically about the people side of things. And so putting this in the context of building a security program or trying to figure out how to achieve security operations with very few people, maybe none right now at all, or maybe a big team, is looking at the size of that team and looking at its strengths, right? So what engineering expertise do you have? What's the size of your analysis team, or what's your capacity for analysis is probably more an appropriate way to think about that. What's your incident handling response capability look like? So once your analysis function has said, we've confirmed a threat, doing the root cause analysis, as Frank was talking about. What's your bandwidth or your capacity for doing that? And then at a high level, the overall risk management and governance. So how do you measure the effectiveness of that program? How do you measure your program's impact on organizational risk? And how do you make sure that you're constantly improving that over time? So that's from a team or expertise perspective. And then the flip side of that is looking at the services that the security organization or function is going to provide. So this is actually, again, this isn't new at all either, right? And if you've worked it for any time in technology, you may be familiar with ITIL, which has the concept of a service catalog, right? What tools does the team support? What processes is the team either undertake on its own, but also what processes is it required to perform on behalf of the business? What's its intelligence capability? So what's that team's bandwidth and ability to, to stay atop of the trends that we're going to talk about and to operationalize detection and response for those. And then, what type of education, training, and outreach is that team, providing within the organization? And this is interesting because when you think about this, particularly, kind of to go back to the ITIL model, you're always being, or frequently being asked to introduce or support new services. And one of the things that you really need to think through is that, as a security organization, if let's say, for instance, you don't have endpoint detection in place today, right? And so you're looking for an endpoint detection and response platform. That's a new service that's going to be added. That's a fairly time-intensive tool to implement, and certainly a significant amount of data that it's going to generate that you now need to go through. So that's going to impose some engineering cost. It's going to impose analysis cost. It's going to impose an incident handling and response cost, and maybe even a risk management cost too, right? I mean, every new tool that you deploy, that thing has to be secured and monitored as well. And so, when you're building, particularly like a really lean program, you're probably doing a good amount already. Probably, I think most folks will probably say that they're doing too much already. Now, if you're going to go add a new service that you support, how are you going to do that, right? Are you either going to add human resources? Are you going to become more efficient, markedly more efficient in one of the things you're delivering today? Or are you going to transition, certain pieces of that to a third party, right? And that's, you augment your staff in those very specialized ways. The next concept we'll kind of talk through is, just kind of prevention versus detection, right? And I don't remember who said it, but the axiom is that prevention's ideal, but detection is a must, right? And so Frank and Casey, I'd love to get kind of your perspective on this. We're going to go into some pretty specific examples here, but actually, so before Casey gets into the specifics, Frank, maybe can you kind of talk through it at kind of like at a high level, what that means, and kind of what that shift or what that ideology means to organizations.
Yeah, absolutely, Keith. The big thing here, like you say, talking about visibility and that operational ability to detect the things that bypass their preventive controls. It really kind of goes and ties in with the last slide, kind of talking about what is the impact of bringing in a new service platform. For instance, with an EDR product, that certainly helps provide visibility on an endpoint well beyond kind of the traditional tools that might exist from that perspective, either from a systems administration side or data loss prevention or even, antivirus. Certainly everybody has antivirus, but it's very limited in the information that it can provide you about, threats that may have taken place on an endpoint. So the EDR helps with that, but then you've got the operational cost of who's going to run it, who's going to maintain it, that sort of thing. I will say from my experience with it, going from a manual process of, okay, we've identified an endpoint that is probably or potentially compromised in some way, and having to do that investigation to determine, do we actually have a security incident here that we're responsible for tracking, reporting, that sort of thing, to that identification of it. From the manual process, taking that incident response, the traditional incident response kind of mixed with forensics, and moving that over to EDR, the visibility that EDR provides and the streamlining of that process cut my time down by 75%. And I tracked that very specifically because I was curious what the benefit would be. So when you talk about having process improvement and greatly improving your efficiency, a lot can be had there. There's also the kind of the flip side to that from analysis. If you're looking at continuous monitoring, then you have to have staff that's going to do that, and you have to weed through a ton of data, simply because the massive volume of data that comes through from those endpoints so far exceeds really anything that you've seen before. And it's something that has to be taken into account. Do you have the staffing? Do you have the expertise to know what you're looking at? And that, kind of gets the, it sounds good, and I would say that it is good, but it's something that you need to take into account.
Oh, thank you, appreciate that. So now what we'll do is turn over to Casey, and what he's going to do. We've talked a lot about understanding or assessing your controls, and taking those controls and operationalizing them. Right? So turning a control into an operational capability that you can use to protect the organization. These couple examples that Casey's going to walk through will be a really good case studies in this. And so particularly if you do have these controls, a really good question to ask as we talk through this is, are we looking at the data that we have in a way that would allow us to detect these things today? If you don't have these controls, then these will be great examples of things that, as you start to consider technical solutions or services, ask of those solution providers, whatever type of solution it may be, are these the types of things that you're able to detect, and what other capabilities does your solution provide? So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Casey.
Sure. So in this slide here, we're looking at we're talking about a PowerShell attack, and there's certainly a number of different attacks. So we just sort of isolated this into one example that we've actually seen in the wild. And we already talked a little bit about why PowerShell and WMI are attractive, because they exist on the target. One of the things that's interesting here in this slide is you're seeing an actual detection. So you're actually seeing some of the telemetry that's been generated by the endpoint. And one of the attributes that we're able to capture is when a process is created, we can actually see the command line that an attacker executed. And this could give us tremendous insight as an analyst or as an organization to try and understand, well, what just happened, and pivot and see maybe what other systems might have been affected by this attack. So at first glance, what we see here is that PowerShell spawned, and if you look at the red component there, you can actually see the command line that executed PowerShell. And there's a few different command line attributes here, but the interesting one is towards the end. It's the -enc, and then followed by a large string of alphanumeric characters. And what PowerShell allows you to do is pass encoded commands, so a command that would be obfuscated or hidden, so to speak, in this blob of text, and actually carry out what's in that stream of data. And so this is really interesting, because if you saw this attack, one of the things you may want to try and understand is, well, what did it do? Why was PowerShell spawned in this particular way? What was the attacker trying to achieve? Those type of questions may come to mind. If you notice at the top, then you can actually see this was sort of a chained attack, and you can see that this particular version of PowerShell was spawned by another built-in tool called RedServe32, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But this is just giving you a real sample of, now you've got some of this data. You've actually got data that you can collect on an attack that an analyst can review and sift through and try and understand what was going on, find out what other systems are affected. And having this kind of visibility gives your organization really some of the best information on the network about what's actually running, what users are running these tools, what commands are normal or not normal, and you start to get a real understanding of where attackers may move in the environment. So this is a real popular attack, PowerShell popular because it bypasses a lot of whitelisting controls, because you need PowerShell to manage the fleet or the environment, but at the same time, attackers know that and they can operate in this mode. So this is just a sample of what you might collect on that particular type of attack. So I think the next one then is interesting too. You saw in that very top line of the previous slide, this was spawned by RedServe32. Well, again, having this telemetry, we can chain that process ancestry back, and we can say, what was the origin of this? Where did it come from? And RedServe32 is a very popular attack that was originated around, like in the spring of 2016, started to get a lot of attention. It's a command line tool that's built in, and what it allows you to do is run a command and reach out to a system either on the network or in another part of your organization, pull in a scripting file, VB script or JScript, just built-in languages, and execute that code. So this would bypass a whitelisting control because you've allowed RedServe32. You often need RedServe32, for example, to run installation of different DLLs or COM objects, those type of registrations. But the idea here is, again, we're able to see and trace back in an attack. We saw PowerShell spawned by RedServe32, and here we would actually be able to see insight into maybe what URL or what location the attackers may have pulled that script from. And then we might pivot and go in and look and say, well, who else has talked to that particular IP address or domain name? Or who else has run RedServe32 with this particular series of command line arguments, which may or may not be normal, which you develop those patterns over time. So this is a well-known whitelisting bypass. It's actually a very popular attack these days, the RedServe32 combined with like a PowerShell launcher. And the thing is, a lot of controls in place today simply aren't going to catch or even detect, A, they don't have the visibility, or B, these are signed trusted binaries by the vendor, and so they're just being used in new and innovative ways. So hopefully that gives you a sampling of not only the attack style or technique, but also the telemetry that gets collected and how that's important to your organization to be able to pivot and investigate the incident. Because very likely if you saw this command on one system, it's probably happened on multiple systems in the organization. And so by looking at this data, we can pivot and look at other aspects of the organization that might have a compromise.
Yeah, that's great, Casey. And I think as you again, as you as like a security leader are thinking through either how to controls that you need or the things that you're going to do with them and the data. Like this one in particular really highlights an interesting problem, right? In that, and even the PowerShell, if we think about those two together and let's, think about them in the context of kind of the time continuum that we laid down in the beginning. So 3 or 4 years ago, right, both of these things would have been wildly successful. PowerShell in particular was very widely abused. Microsoft responded as a platform provider and made visibility and logging available, as Casey discussed earlier, and as Frank highlighted too, from an investigation standpoint. So, things like PowerShell now, you've got a lot of the next gen AV products and things like that. They're starting to do a better job of detecting malicious use of those types of tools. This attack in particular is kind of, if you think about it as a spectrum or a continuum, a little bit farther to the right. So, both of these things being attacks, living off the land, so to speak, doesn't mean that they're not preventable, and it doesn't mean that preventive controls won't eventually catch up and get better at these things. The important thing to think through is that, when you're building, and we'll actually just skip right ahead to kind of talk through kind of improvements and strategies here. The first thing that we highlight here in terms of continuous improvement is that, gaining visibility is really like a foundational step that you want to take. And again, network and endpoint visibility, and that's critical. Once you've done that, then what you want to do there is understand, not just what your preventative controls address, but that there are going to be classes of attacks, and so within one class of attack, your preventative controls might help you by, for instance, taking a lot of the known PowerShell abuse and dealing with that, so that you don't have to from a detection and response standpoint. However, that class of attack still exists. There's still a lot left to do there. And looking at things like RedServer and some of the other core Windows and platform services, this applies to all platforms. Those classes of attack exist, and there are entire classes of attack that haven't been discovered yet. So, gaining visibility and gaining visibility in such a way that not only can you detect known attacks, but you position yourself to effectively investigate and respond to classes of attack that have not yet been identified is absolutely critical, right? To Frank's point earlier, if you have a class of attack that you've never seen before, right? So a new technique, a new piece of malware that bypasses your preventative controls, you really have two options for getting to a root cause, right? Either you've already collected a tremendous amount of data. Now you go through the exercise of rewinding that data and looking through it, or you have to go look retroactively and see what you might have in logs, or go image those systems and see what that might yield. That's expensive, right? And it's really costly. So architecting your environment and setting your team up such that you're putting that visibility in place now, even if you can't operationalize all of it right away, put it in place, assume that there's going to be a compromise or a bypass of your preventative controls, and put yourself in a position to effectively address that. And again, we mentioned here continuous improvement, right? And that if you remember the cycle in the beginning, that people, process, and technology, and like there's a never-ending kind of cycle there of improvement and feedback that has to take place. The other recommendation is, so traditionally, organizations, and particularly in financial services, where again, that vertical has really been very forward-leaning in terms of security controls, partly because of regulation, but partly because of just meaningful financial risk, has really focused a lot on compliance and on preventative controls, right? So working, very far to the left-hand side of that spectrum, the managed detection and response as a discipline is really grounded in that understanding that visibility matters, and operationalizing, helping companies operationalize those technologies and that data to find things that are bypassing preventative controls, right? So, in terms of like what a full operational capability looks like, that means putting in place some sort of endpoint detection and response platform. And again, doesn't matter what that platform is, but getting that collection in place, having some team of experts who can, constantly keeping abreast of current threats, taking those threats and turning them into detection criteria, analyzing them and helping to respond. And that maturity of process, right? Everything that goes around that, QC for the analysis process itself, making the response portion of that process much more efficient, all of the intelligence curation, but also just, training and governance and things like that. So it highly effective backstop for, the much more traditional controls. And really, if you kind of think through everything that we've talked about, is effectively delivery of security operations at some significant scale. So at this point, we'll see, we'll take any questions that we have from the audience.
That said, we do have some questions. The first one I'll throw out to the panel. We all know that examiners tend to be creatures of habit, and they rely on technologies for which they're familiar, IPS, antivirus, firewall. How do we get them to accept EDR, MDR as a viable control objective? Gentlemen?
Casey, do you want to take a first stab at that? I know you've worked in organizations that have of meaningful size that have kind of gone through that full shift. So maybe your perspective there would be really helpful.
Sure. I think it was really having a conversation when we had to meet with examiners to help them understand, for example, that our application of whitelisting controls were the anti-malware solution, because it's a relatively new control. Same with EDR and MDR. The idea here is these endpoint detections or managed detections would be components that are above some of the other controls, or go above and beyond those other controls. So I feel like having the conversations with the examiners to make sure they understand what the technology does, and some of it's just education with them about how you're using this to combat some of the new evolving threats. I think that was the approach that we took, was really just making sure that we walked them through exactly where that tool or our provider fit in our prevention and detection and response stack.
Yeah, one thing I'll add in there too is that, as you're evaluating EDR solutions, MDR solutions, or really like any security control, be forthcoming with questions for vendors about where exactly they fit. Because even if you look within what I'm holding up my quotey fingers, the endpoint detection and response, or EDR, like controls in that space vary widely, right? And you've got a lot of convergence taking place, both, particularly within each, EDR provider. So, to think about that, rewinding a few years, EDR was almost exclusively a collection or a visibility discipline. And now you're starting to see, they've been collecting a tremendous amount of data for a long time, and customers are asking the natural question, which is, if you've got so much visibility, and if that visibility can be used to do really deep detection over time, why can't we take some of that and turn it into like even slightly improved prevention? And so, those types of things you can ask a vendors just, to hopefully they'll be very frank with you about the capabilities of the product, what it can do, what it can't do, and ask about roadmap too. That's probably, I think, like this year in particular, there's probably no more important time than to ask, whether it's an EDR vendor dealing with product or an MDR vendor, a managed detection and response vendor in particular, that that's dealing with a product and an security operations as a service. Ask them what their roadmap looks like, right? And see how that maps to the things that, like, not just the things that you need to do today, but in the out years, is that roadmap going to converge with, for instance, the next generation of preventative controls that you want to put in place, and see if you can't get a little bit ahead of that.
Oh, yeah, we've got some other questions here. We got time probably for a couple more. Question I have is, if so much data is going into the EDR platform, how can an MDR filter out the noise? And from that, are the alerts high fidelity? In other words, if we're already short-staffed, how can we deal with more alerts?
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, Frank, you want to take a stab at this? Frank's front and center on the operations side of this, and deals very closely with delivery of the analysis and the SOC component of MDR.
Yeah. So, I mean, everybody's familiar with I think that kind of a concept, going back to SIM products. The idea is you're getting a ton of data in, and you want to automate filtering that out, so you get down to the interesting bits to look at. The challenge is, as anybody who's ever dealt with a SIM platform, is that takes a lot of time and effort and specialized knowledge to be able to filter out that noise. And so that's one of the aspects where an MDR can come in from that managed perspective. And it's the same type of thing that MSSPs do as well, right? At a high level, we're very similar in that respect. You've got the typical funnel, bunch of data coming in, and you want a very small amount of data coming out. With an EDR platform, and looking at that from a managed perspective, the amount of data going into it is so voluminous that it can be difficult to handle from a number of angles: the technology, the people, and the process. I mean, that whole aspect of it. Having that expert team of analysts, aside from the engine perspective, offload that, kind of offloading that challenge to let somebody else's engine filter down through it, so you're not looking at hundreds or thousands of potential problems every day, and getting that down to where their analysts are looking at it and sending you the one or two things, that small handful that are actually of concern, have already been triaged, already been identified as, yes, this is definitely something that you need to look at. And here's kind of the chain of activity that goes with it, so that when you go in, you're not having to start from ground zero. Oh, there was an alert. It was maybe a bad thing. Go look it up. You know exactly where you need to go, what you need to look at, can formulate that plan of attack to take on the adversary, or whatever particular scenario you have. It's a huge time save, and really, from my perspective, having been on the other side of it, it's really a huge headache gone.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. And it looks like we're coming up on time. I'll kind of tack on to that to say that when you're looking at, particularly if you think about it in the context of traditional service providers, where that funnel gets really interesting. So the more visibility you introduce, the more data you have, but the more opportunity you have to do a really good root cause analysis. So, whereas most of the traditional controls or MSSPs that are looking at a lot of things, but at a more superficial level, they're largely taking in a whole bunch of alerts. They're down selecting to the alerts that they think are likely threats, and then they're forwarding those to you to investigate. There's still a pretty substantial analytic burden there. You're still they're generating more questions. As you increase visibility, and if you find an MDR provider that can partner with you in an effective way, what you get from that is that you have a tremendous amount of data coming in. That MDR vendor is looking at a substantial number of potential threats. The things that go to you are not just more likely to be bad or more likely to be of interest, but they've actually been looked at and confirmed. And you've got some root cause analysis there that gets delivered out of the gate. So I think that's probably one of the most interesting ways to kind of think about that funnel, is that it's not as simple as data in, data out. You have an opportunity, if you do it right, to get a much higher quality of output that has a very kind of positive long tail effect on your staffing costs and your ability to manage growth.
Well, very good. We have hit the bottom of the hour here, so I want to thank Keith, Casey, Frank, each of you for your presentation for today, and thanks for taking time to answer these questions as well.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Of course, I also want to thank each of our attendees. You took time out of your day to attend this session, and we're grateful. I trust that today's discussion provided valuable new data points and new information to help you and your organization be even better prepared to tackle the security challenges we discussed today. I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming events. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field.